So we're continuing our series, or we've started a series 2 weeks ago on the inner self, and we're talking about what the inner self looks like and what really is going on inside ourselves. It's we have a constant obligation, or there's a constant pressure going on inside ourselves that's wanting certain things, and it's easy to project it out. It's easy to think that we should change this or get another that, or change this, or leave this person and go, find somebody else to be friends with, or get a new car, or change house. Whenever we have a discomfort, we tend to look for a reason, and our mind gives us a reason, and we want to change that. And that's seldom the real problem. And most of us spend most of our lives changing the outsides and never getting any closer to ourselves. And so we're really needing to begin to understand what the inner dynamics are in ourselves, and particularly the relationship between our inner true self and our inner false self. I spoke recently about the split that we develop early on in our lives, where the outer self, the self that is well-mannered, the self that people see, the self that people respond to, is shaped by society. But within us, there's a self that reacts, that controls, that wants control, that manages things, that affects us profoundly, and is the part of ourselves that actually keeps us in a particular way of being. It's the critical self. It's the feeling sorry for itself self. It's the self with attitudes. It's the self that is never satisfied, or the self that thinks there's never enough of something, or the self that thinks that you weren't the favored child, or that life has done you hard by. You've been done hard by life. It's the self that within us judges reality and tells us things that affect us profoundly. And I've come to call it the false self, because that's not really who we are. It's the self that has responded or reacted to the outer self. From the outer self, there's been a tremendous pressure to conform. And some of us have become compliant and good conformers from early on in our lives. Others of us have become reactive. Others of us have become more critical. Others of us have become different. We've decided to go our own way and not worry about the pressure from outside. But for most of us, we've had to fit in. We've had to, at school, do our homework, say please, say thank you, say sorry. We've had to comply. And so there's a very strong pressure to conform to society. And our response to that is that part of ourselves that fights back, that reacts, that tells itself certain things. And I want us to look at that inner self and what's going on inside ourselves, because within here is really the issues that we need to face in our lives, not on the outside. And so it's the self, I think, that Jesus calls us to shift, to change. In fact, he says it quite dramatically. He says we need to allow the inner self to die. The false self that keeps us stuck on certain patterns of being. And if you look at your own life and how you live, you'll see that we've developed particular patterns. We've all developed ways of being. And within a family or within a group, we'll have different ways of being. One person will be quite negative, quite pessimistic. Another person in the same context might be quite optimistic. And one can ask ourselves, why do we choose different ways of being? Why do we choose different patterns of responding? And what keeps us in those patterns of responding? Because often a negative person will remain negative and will become more negative. Not often that they become positive halfway through life. A positive person might become more positive, or might even become idealistic and unreal. So the patterns we begin to show from early on in our lives tend to develop and deepen, and those patterns then become what controls us. and who we think we are, because we have a perspective, we see in a particular way, and we think that's me, that's how I am, and I'm different from you, and so we develop that inner self, but that inner self is in response or in reaction to the outside world. It's not the deeper self, and I don't want to get confused because it's easy to get confusing, but the inner self, there are two parts to it. The self that's responding to the outer world, and the self that is wanting to respond to God, wanting to respond to deeper honesty and reality, wanting to grow, wanting to become its true self. God has made us to be a unique person, and that's the self that He wants us to grow in. And so it's like we have this interior civil war in a way, because on one level we want to prove something, we want to react in some way, we want to show the world, or we want to just protect ourselves from the world. We have a very strong defended self against the world and what the world demands, even if that self is quite passive. Some people get sick all the time, and that's their way of controlling. I was counseling somebody recently whose mother was always in bed. She was always depressed, she was always had something wrong with her, and that was her way of controlling reality. Because whenever something didn't suit her, oh, she wasn't feeling well, she went to bed. And this boy kept feeling like he could never expect something. It was always on her terms, and whenever it didn't suit her, she just was sick or was depressed, and so he felt like he never really had a shared relationship with his mom. It was always on her terms. It was always how she wanted it. It was always what she got in the end. And she controlled the whole family with her sickness, with apparent sickness. I think we call it hypochondria, where there's always something wrong. So we develop patterns within that easily tries to control life. And sometimes those very same patterns want to control God. People who have rejected God, people who feel that maybe God doesn't exist, or God is unfair, or God is not loving, they found that out themselves. They've made that up themselves. It's not the real God that they're responding to. It's the God that they've sort of come to shape in themselves, because maybe they feel their brother or sister was more attractive than they are, or why did God allow me to marry that person? Didn't He know that would be a disaster? Or why didn't God heal my mother? Or whenever we put God we question God. It's a setup, because we say, if God had done that, I would believe in God. But because God didn't do what I wanted or expected, I don't believe in God. So that inner self gets very complex. It manages reality along its own terms. And that inner self ends up being our own prison. That inner self becomes where we are stuck in ourselves. And not even God can save us from that place. If we don't want to come out, if we don't want to change, if we don't realize that we need to change, or that that's where the problem lies, we can end up being quite tyrannical in our relationships, quite despotic, because we do it on our terms, or we see it the way we want to see it, and no other way will shift us. And so it's our growth path is very determined by our own attitudes to our own inner self. The way we respond to ourselves, the way we relate to ourselves, is the way our lives unfold. But most of us think that our life isn't what it should be, or we would like it to be, because of some outside reasons. But actually all the reasons are inside. Does that make sense? We are our own worst enemy, so to speak, because we have particular attitudes, we have particular ways of being that control our reality. And our relationship with that inner self is where we are at the moment. We are the product, our lives at the moment are the product of how our internal life has been lived all our lives. The assumptions we've made, the beliefs we've hung on to, the judgments that we've nurtured, the ways we've seen people. I mean, we can just ask ourselves, why do I like certain people and dislike other people? What is it about the other people that makes me not want to see them or not want to have anything to do with them? Is it the people or is it me? Relationships that you've been in, friendships, even long-term relationships that have ended. Why did these relationships end? What part did I have to play in that? Was it because I didn't want to hear the other person's point of view? Was it because I was critical? Was it because I wanted more than was reasonable to ask for? Our relationships, I think, are the biggest telltale of our inner self, because it's almost like we play out that inner story. We play out our inner agenda. And when relationships start to fail, we need to ask ourselves, where am I not wanting to move or shift or change? And so it's important that we not take ourselves as a given. I often hear people saying, well, that's me, take it or leave it. And it's easy holding that sort of assumption and then making any problem everybody else's problem. Whereas I think if we become more transparent and more able to reflect on our own behavior, we might find that there's actually more that we need to do to actually ameliorate the situation. Jesus said, why do you have so much energy to take the splinter out of the other person's eye when there's a beam in your own eye? And so often people we react to or don't like represent something for us that we won't accept in ourselves. And it's easier to blame them and to want to fix them up than to actually be honest with ourselves and face ourselves. So you might just reflect on the relationships you struggle with and say, what in myself am I not prepared to face?